Stall, Full Circle. Also, we support a lot of NGOs, Umang, Help in Suffering, Himjoli, Pratham Book, Radha Swami Satsang Bias. Also, the Full Circle bookstore is also there. They have the credit card system now, so you can go buy your favorite books. So let's please welcome Navtej Sarna in conversation with Urvashi Butalia.
Morning, everyone. Welcome. Let me add my list of please do this and please do that. You've heard a long list. Please listen to our session attentively. So what we're going to be doing, it's called Savage Harvest. That's the title of a collection of stories about partition, written by Navtej Sarna's father, Mohinder Singh Sarna, quite a while back, and translated by Navtej into English from Punjabi, from Gurmukhi. We're going to be talking principally about this work, but also about the themes that underlie the work. Navtej himself is a diplomat, career diplomat, been ambassador to many places. He's also a writer. He's written a number of novels. And he's also translated the Zafarnama from Persian, a beautiful translation, and has many more books in his head. Comes from a literary family. And his father's work, the book that we are going to be looking at, looks at 1947, the Partition of India, and is a collection of stories which Navtej has selected, which deal with the issues that underlie the Partition of India. So we will be talking not only specifically about the work, which many of you may not be familiar with, but with the broader themes of partition and writing violence and memory and how writers have dealt with this major event in our history. We're going to start in a slightly unusual way with Navtej reading a small story from the book, and then we'll get into the broader discussion after that. So Navtej.
Thank you very much, Urvashi, and good afternoon to everybody. Can't hear me.
You have to bring the mic thoda idhar. You see, आपकी दाढ़ी में आ रहा है ना ये इस पे लगा लो स्कार्फ के ऊपर. I think, yeah, that's better.
Can you hear me now? I don't think this is working.
इसको देख लें आप नहीं तो आप ये लगा दीजिए. I'll take ये लगा दीजिए. I'll take the hand mic.
इधर मत लगाइए. Is that better? Yes. Thank you.
It's always the women who know how to use technology.
It's always the women who know how to do everything. Well, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Urvashi, for that introduction. Yes, I think I will start with a reading because, after all, it is a session on the short stories, and then we can go to the broader areas. So we have the shortest of the short stories, just 2 lines about it, about the book, and so that you know what the short story is trying to do. These are all stories set during the Partition of India, which, as you know, was marked by large, immense scale of bloodshed and violence and killing on both sides of what became the border between India and Pakistan. But Each of these stories deals with a certain element of humanity, which rose up, which was evident during the violence and during the barbarism that was happening. And this element of humanity was irrespective of the religion that the person belonged to. So I think with that short introduction, I'll read the story. It's called A Defender of Humanity. Today, I thought of you again. I always remember you this way, all of a sudden. And I remember you often. Always when the sun is shining brightly on my life, chasing away the shadows, when the valley of my life is wreathed in smiles, when sunflowers are blooming, when my son comes back victorious from some debate competition, when my daughter makes a new design of Japanese ikebana, when my wife puts a plate of my favorite peas pulao in front of me, wipes her hands on the end of her sari, and smiles at me, I remember you all of a sudden with all my heart. That was how it happened today. My daughter was telling jokes, and we were all doubling up with laughter. She's got an endless store of jokes. Doctor jokes, lawyer jokes, husband-wife jokes, priest jokes, truck driver jokes. Today she was cracking truck driver jokes when, without warning, my eyes filled up with tears, and I left the lawn and withdrew to my room. I could hear my daughter's voice coming after me. I bet that Papa has gone to write a story. I hadn't gotten up from the lawn to write a story, but my daughter's words woke up your story inside me. Why not write your story today, the story that has been stoking your memory in my mind for these last 36 years? That cloudy morning of September 47 is fresh in my mind, the morning when all of us climbed into your lorry. You were in the driver's seat, intently looking into the mirror to straighten the Pathan turban that you had tied over the little black cap on your head. Outside the lorry, it was all mist and cloud. Inside, there was utter terror. The passengers sat huddled into themselves, their hearts in their mouths. Even in this atmosphere of fear, I was transfixed by your fine features, your handsome face. The mingling of Pathani, Pothohari, Greek and Afghani beauty that had been taking place for centuries in northwestern India seemed to have reached its apogee in your face. Suddenly someone exclaimed, "Look, the earlier lorry has returned." We all turned to look. The lorry that had left at 6 in the morning from Rawalpindi for Srinagar had indeed returned. Its passengers were frozen with fear, unable to speak. But its Muslim driver was relating with extravagant gestures how the tribals had reached the road that ran from Rawalpindi to Srinagar, how they had fired upon the lorry near Ghoda Gali and tried to puncture its tires, how he had not lost his nerve but had brought the passengers back to safety by driving the lorry in reverse gear for nearly 6 furlongs. There was no joy on the faces of the passengers who had been rescued. They knew that the death they had escaped now awaited them here. All the routes for getting out of Rawalpindi to India had been cut off. Train loads of passengers were being massacred even before they got to Jhelum or Wazirabad. In the last 10 days, not a single train had managed to pass Lahore and reach Amritsar safely, and now there were no trains running at all. There had been some hope of escaping by road towards Srinagar. Now this hope too had been strangled by the tribal raiders. The stabbing incidents in Rawalpindi itself were on the rise, and one by one they would all be killed. They hadn't a shred of hope left. At that moment, you turned back and looked at your passengers, saw their distress, read the intense hopelessness in their eyes, and took measure of the terror that gripped their souls. I saw a dark glint appear in your fearless eyes. Thumping your chest, you said, I will take you to Srinagar, even if I have to stake my life on it. Are you ready to go? Such courage coming from a Muslim driver couldn't but touch the hearts of the Hindu and Sikh passengers. They were ready to go. In any case, they had no choice. The driver of the first lorry pleaded, don't go, Hussein. Think of yourself. You have an old mother, an unwed sister. But you paid him no heed and put your foot down on the accelerator. Nurpur, Komari, Nathya Gali, Ghoda Gali passed without incident. Kohala was 25 miles from Ghoda Gali. At Kohala, there was a bridge across the Jhelum River. On this side of the bridge, the new country of Pakistan ended. And on the other side, the territory of Kashmir state began. It was downhill all the way from Ghoda Gali to Kohala, and the lorry had picked up speed. But the passengers were still afraid. Would they ever cross that bridge to breathe free in the India of Gandhi and Nehru? Or would their bodies be picked to the bone by vultures on these rough, hilly slopes under a merciless sky? Holding their breath, they watched each passing milestone. Now Kohala was 17 miles away. Then suddenly we heard gunfire and saw blood spurting from your left arm. Behind me sat Pritam Singh Sodhi, a compounder who used to volunteer his services at Rawalpindi's Singh Sabha's charitable hospital. He jumped to his feet. Your wound wasn't deep. The bullet had gouged a gash through your muscle and gone out of the lorry's window. Pritam Singh Sodhi took out the first aid kit from his suitcase and bandaged you. Even as he was ministering to you, you didn't let the lorry's speed slacken one bit. You had lost a lot of blood, but your face was still flushed with determination, and the black glint in your fearless eyes had not dimmed a whit. We heard the sound of gunshots again when we were only 12 miles from Kohala. We looked in all directions. 20 yards behind us stood 4 young tribal men, their rifles aimed at the lorry's tires. Is there a driver among you, you asked, without taking your eyes off the road? If so, then he should come up here fast. Jot Singh spoke up. I've been driving buses for the Nanda bus service from Pindi to Lahore, but I don't have any experience of hilly roads. Hold the steering wheel, you said. It's downhill all the way to Kohala. Keep your foot on the brake, and for the sake of your guru, don't stop the lorry this side of Kohala. And you stepped up to Sardar Shamsher Singh and request, Sardarji, please give me your sword. Uncomprehensive, but without a minute's hesitation, Sardar Shamsher Singh handed you his 3-foot-long sword. You unsheathed it and jumped off the moving lorry, saying, God be with you. We saw you roll into the bushes and then swerve off into the bunch of trees. In your hand was the gleaming sword that Guru Gobind Singh had put into the hands of the Khalsa to protect the weak. It looked beautiful in your hand because it was the sword of humanity, and you were the defender of humanity. 3 more bullets were fired, but they didn't touch the tires. Then the bullets stopped. We could see that your gleaming sword had caused pandemonium among those young tribals. I don't know what happened to you. You were 1 against 4. And who knows how many more were hiding in the trees. And they had rifles. When you jumped out of the moving lorry, I sent up a prayer. May Allah protect you, Hussein. May He grant you the remaining lifespan of cowards like me. I do not know if He heard my prayer or whether they finished you off. What happened to your mother, what became of your sister, that too I do not know. But I remember you often, and always in the happy moments of my life. This life and its joys are your gift to me. This is why, when your memory knocks at my door, 100 prayers burst forth from my heart. I hope to God that you are still alive. But if you are not, I hope that Allah has given you a place in heaven. Wherever you are, through this story today, I send you my salutation, the salutation of my wife, son, and daughter, and of all humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Navtej. That's a really beautiful story.
Thank you.
In your father's collection, there are many Husseins like this. Your father was himself a
partition survivor. He moved from Rawalpindi to what became India. He, like many men or many people of his generation, saw the worst of what happened at partition and the best of what happened at partition. But so much of the terrible stuff. And yet the writing is so full of humanity and compassion. Where do you think that came from, the distillation of this terrible experience of violence into something that allows for hope?
I think that's really a very, very good question, because I mean, the immediate impact of what he must have seen for any human being, or what millions of others like him would have seen, would be one of absolute terror, absolute hatred, absolute. But he did see this on both sides. He saw a huge amount of killing and riots when he was trapped in Rawalpindi. He did see lots of people going across and not being able to cross the border, some lucky ones escaping. And when he crossed over finally to India and traveled in the area of Amritsar, etc., on a military convoy, he saw the same thing being done here by Hindus and Sikhs to Muslims. Absolutely innocent people being massacred for no reason whatsoever. So I think probably it was the writer in him, which took a different take ultimately years later, or whenever he started writing, because I think he had a kind of credo, which is, if I may just read out 3 or 4 lines, which I've quoted in the introduction, is that he says, "I am not without hope. Hopelessness leads to death and destruction, and it has never been my intention to put foot on that path. A writer who is without hope has no right to be satiric. I did not lose faith even when faced by the barbarity of partition. My partition stories pass knee-deep through the dark quicksand of blood and crushed bone, but they keep their head, on which they carry their bundle of hope, clearly above the quicksand. This hope is kept intact even in the whirlwinds of brutality and barbarity." I think essentially the hope was that there were people from all religions who acted as simply as human beings, and they did not let the extremism or the desire for revenge extinguish this spirit of humanity. So I would say it was probably the writer in him who recognized the spirit of humanity, and that fed the hopeful tenor of these stories.
Tell us something about how he became a writer.
I think he was a writer to begin with, and he remained a writer all his life, although, like many of us, he did a day job. He was also a government officer. He became a writer when he was very, very young, and he started working in Delhi, although his home was Rawalpindi, and he started writing short stories and poems in Punjabi. And when he was about maybe 17 or 18 or 19, one of his short stories got picked up by the great Punjabi poet of the days, who was Mohan Singh. And by Mohan Singh, and he was writing, he used to have a magazine called Panch Darya from Lahore. So he picked up that story from somewhere and he published it. And then he published 4 or 5 other stories. So my father got very encouraged. And when he went to meet him, he told him, "You have obviously read a lot of Russian writers, because your characters have the stamp of Russian peasants." So my father, who had not read a single book by Russian writers till then said that, "I haven't read anybody, but now that you mention this, I will read all of them." So he went, and we still have those red, hard-covered books of Gorky and others at home. So he became a writer when he was less than 20, and his very first novel became an instant success at the age of 21, and that is still being taught in various courses, etc. So, well, long time back.
So many of the stories that you find in this book are, if you read the introduction, which tells you a little bit about the life other incident from his life and then transform it into something else. One of the stories that I found very moving and which reminded me of the iconic Manto story, Tovatek Singh, which talks about a man who is supposed to be half mad, is the story of the flight.
Basanta.
Yeah, there is a flight coming from Pakistan to India. It's absolutely full, and the protagonist of the story meets a family who want their daughter, I think your daughter-in-law, who's just been newly married, and they want a seat for her, and they plead that she can even go standing. And of course the pilot has said nobody can go standing. And then they ask if somebody will give up the seat, and there's this one man called Basant Singh who gives up the seat and stays on. And years later, the protagonist of the story meets his mother and finds out what had happened to this person. And again, it's left like, you don't know whether he's still alive, you don't know whether he's been caught in something else. But the man who was considered marginal actually makes this great act of humanity, and that is really very moving.
Yeah, that in a way is there's a bit of satire in that, because this fact that a man who's considered the village fool, who's considered mad, and who's always walking around with a drool falling down his face, is actually in that whole crowd, he's the true human being, he's the real man, who sees the plight of this young girl who's betrothed to a family on this side of the border, and her old parents, all they want to do is that she should reach her rightful home. And nobody else is willing to give up his seat on the chartered plane because it means life, and staying there means death. And except this so-called madman who says, no, go, take my seat. And nobody stops him, even his old mother doesn't stop him, because it is such a genuine act of compassion. So sometimes the marginal, and even in some of the stories, forget the marginal human being, it's the animals who are shown as to be better than men. There are dogs in the story, some of the stories, who are the real heroes. And there is a story, it's called The Precious One, in which when the rioters are coming and this young girl who is in danger of being raped at the hands of the rioters, in Punjab, what happened in those days is, at least in Western Punjab, the gurdwaras were distributing bits of poison to all young girls. And they used to tie up that poison and keep it, that in case we are about to lose our honor and be raped at the hands of rioters, we would rather die with honor. And they would swallow the poison and die or jump into wells. It happened thousands of girls, as you know, you have written about these things. And this girl cannot find that, in that moment of crisis, she can't find that bit of poison. And the dog stands and guards her until she finds that bit of poison and dies. And then the dog is killed. So when the mother finds the body of her daughter and is cremating her, and then she finds the body of the dog, and she says, no, he deserves to be on the same funeral pyre as my daughter. And she blesses the dog to say, she blesses the and she blesses the dog and says that, I wish in your next life you were born a dog and not a human being. So there are these kind of things.
So much of partition writing of the first generation of writers after partition, who wrote not in the immediate aftermath, because I think there was, it was really difficult to do so, but who wrote in the 50s, 60s, etc. So much of it has sort of deals with this kind of humanity and compassion and so on. Why has it taken such a long time for this literature to be translated into English and to move from Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu into other languages of India? Do you have
well, frankly, I think it's our own loss that we haven't had more translations from Urdu, from Punjabi, from Hindi, in which a huge wealth of partition literature does exist. But as we were discussing in one of the panels yesterday, this so-called concept of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming very often, if you're going to reach wider audiences, means translation into English. And this has not happened. I don't know, it's I suppose a combination of lack of desire of publishers, writers, translators, critics, the public. If we want more, we ask for it and we probably will get it. But in the languages, it does exist, and it has come out in bits and pieces. I mean, Manto has come out in English a long time back, and he's very, very well known, but there are several others in each of the 3 languages. And I'm sure they are in Bengal, because partition happened there too.
Yeah, no, there are many writers in Bengal. I'm not sure if it is a lack of, desire or it could be a lack of interest. And because I'm a publisher, I don't accept that accusation against publishers.
I provoked you.
But I'm just wondering whether it is what we see reflected in the histories of that time, which is a kind of reluctance to confront this moment in our history and in our past, because it so contradicts the narrative of the nation becoming independent. And it sort of bloodies that narrative with loss of life and despair and grief and so on.
But I think you have a point there, because and some of these stories also, it is written, and a lot of this is said in the partition families, and there are several people here who must be having partition families. It is said that for some people, partition of freedom fell into their laps while they were sitting in their homes. For other people, freedom meant death. Freedom meant loss of a home, loss of an entire way of life, loss of an economic standing. I mean, the families that came from there had lands, had houses, had gold, had various things that families normally have. And when they came here, they became what we call refugees. So all of Delhi suddenly became a city of refugees. So obviously they they desire to resuscitate themselves, to absolutely rebuild their lives from scratch, put away the grief, put away the loss, put away that in the daily struggle for moving on. I mean, it was like, where do we live? How do we earn? How do we feed ourselves? How do we clothe ourselves? How do we study? Most of the people who came, the children of that age, for instance, our parents, I'm sure this is a sentiment shared by many, never completed their degree in a proper college, because there were no colleges. So my mother always talks of something called camp college. A camp college was a set of tents set up in Delhi, and they would go float around there and study on their own somehow, and somehow got a degree from somewhere. And so all lives were disrupted. So the immediate human instinct is to rebuild, to survive, to cling on, and not to wallow in the grief. So that's, I suppose, what happened. And then comes a time when you begin to look back and you see what you lost, and the literature comes, and the analysis comes, and the need to keep aflame memory. That comes. Because there's, again, the human desire that we must pass this on to the next generation. Your children will never know what your grandparents experienced. So then you get into that mode. So I suppose, this is I try an explanation.
The way you describe your father in your introduction, Navtej, is as a very reticent man. A lot of honors cases, they really rush out to meet them. He accepted them, but they never made that much of he wasn't the kind of writer who needed all of that. A lot of people wrote into him, and he read their letters, and you described this wonderful incident where you actually, somebody from Poland, you discovered this letter from somebody from Poland.
It's a very interesting story.
So I want you to talk about that incident, but also to talk a little more about whether in your family, given that your father was so reticent, did you hear these stories of partition again and again, or did you only meet them in his writing?
Just to start off with that little incident, this was very interesting. In the 70s, suddenly we got 2 letters written in absolutely perfect Punjabi in Gurmukhi script from Warsaw, Poland, telling my father how much that person loved a particular story, etc. 2 letters came, and we put them away somewhere. And maybe 10 years later, I was posted as a diplomat to Poland in the early mid-80s. And I went to my father and I said, can I get those letters because I would like to meet this man. And of course, we hunted up and down and we didn't find those letters, the way things happen. I reached Warsaw, and at my first gathering that I organized, which included a lot of Indology teachers and professors, I related this incident to one of the senior professors. And it didn't take him more than 10 seconds. He said, there can only be one person who can do this in this entire country. And this is his name. He's a librarian in the Warsaw University. But be very careful how you approach him, because he's a very shy man. He's a heart patient. He doesn't like any sort of social interaction, etc. So it took me a couple of weeks to sort of gingerly make my way to him so as not to disturb him. And he invited me home for a cup of tea. And I can't ever forget that sight of him sitting on an old sofa with his wife in a small apartment, and behind him this huge bookshelf, which had at least a row of my father's books, including some of the first editions, and rows of other Indian writers in different languages, sitting in this snowbound little apartment in Warsaw. It was a very emotional moment, but that's the way things happen. Yes, you're absolutely right. He was extremely reticent. He would not, I mean, if I ever, those days they didn't have literary festivals. If somebody ever invited him to a literary festival, he'd probably have a nervous breakdown. So he used to simply sit on his bed and write, and the publisher would come home. He never signed a contract in his life. He never signed anything. They would come and take the book, publish it, and sell it, and do whatever they wanted to with it. But he wouldn't talk too much about the partition story, because he had seen it too close. And for years, nobody talked about partition in our house, because my father's younger sister was lost during the riots. And she was newly married, and she was presumably killed. And nobody would talk about it because it would upset everybody. So it was sort of a, it was a trick of survival, silence. It was complete survival. So whatever you found in the stories, but you didn't find it in conversations over the dinner table.
And yet so many of the stories actually were born from personal experience, as we were
Absolutely.
talking earlier.
Absolutely.
I mean, even the story of the flight, you described somewhere that when he left, he got the last seat on the flight.
Yeah, my grandfather was a bank manager in Rawalpindi, and my grandfather and his 2 sons, including my father, were trapped in that, and there were riots happening all around. And finally, somebody who, like in the story, charters a plane, because he's a rich person. This side, he's got maybe 4 members of his family trapped there. They used to charter planes. They'd take their 4 members, sell the other seats to make up the cost of the flight. So one such gentleman came up to my grandfather to close his account in the bank. So my grandfather asked him, do you have 3 seats? And he said, I'm sorry, they're all sold, but I can give you 1. So it's a bit of a Sophie's choice situation. And so my grandfather said, then please take my elder son, because the younger children are already that side, and he will be able to take care of them. And that is how my father was put on the flight.
It's interesting what Navtej says about the phrase that he used, silence became a method of survival. In many ways, the silenced histories of women during partition.
You've done this whole book, which is called The Other Side of Silence, which deals with the partition and the silence. So why don't you tell us something?
But this session is about you. So I'm going to throw the question back at you, but just to elaborate on it a little bit, because, when Navtej talks about his father's sister and the family losing track of her, and possibly she was killed, other possibilities are that she was abducted, that she was raped, that she was forcibly married, which is what happened to so many women, sold into prostitution, I mean, the figures are quite startling. It's believed that about 100,000 women were abducted, raped, lost, taken away during partition. Many of them killed themselves by throwing themselves into wells, and many were killed by their families, as he mentioned earlier. And for those who survived, their stories were actually never really heard, except until recently when stories started to open up. But those women themselves have disappeared out of those stories, and many never spoke about them, because really silence, for the family, silence became a way of wiping out the histories of those women. Because in some ways, not having them there or not being able to rescue them was a failure of the men in the family and so on. And for the women themselves, silence became a way of survival.
You're absolutely right, because, people would come back with stories of different families, and I'm talking, that, your daughter, she was seen there in Pakistan. Say, when the pilgrim jathas go to the gurdwaras, they would see, we think we saw your daughter or granddaughter or sister there, and she was looking for links to this family. And what do you have? In 9 cases out of 10, the family that has survived says they close their ears, they close their eyes, they don't want to know what happened to her, who she went and married, what she went through, has she changed her religion? So they don't want to know. So they put their, there would be some families who actually go and search out and reconcile and bring people together. But this is, it's terrible. There's no other word for it.
I mean, it's like they don't want to know because the stigma of rape stays on the woman, gets transferred to the family. But the other side of that coin also is that many women who might have been abducted eventually found or formed relationships with their abductors. So when families or when the states went to bring them back or try to pull them out of that, they refused to go.
Well, and here again, it's not only trans religions that these things have happened. For instance, there is one story here which talks of the same Muslim family where one sister is here and the other sister is there, and there is this idea of or their cousins, and there is this idea that their children may get married. And so the sister from here travels with her very, very beautiful daughter across to Rawalpindi and Islamabad, and tries to see whether this can happen, the marriage between the 2 cousins or second cousins, whatever they were. And there it comes a cropper, because then the husband of the head of the family on that side, he is so irritated because of what's happening between India and Pakistan on Kashmir, that he does not allow this marriage. So, so it's not the fact that there were people from different religions only, or so that even within the same religion, these divides and differences came through years of living in 2 different societies, 2 different countries.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned marriage, because one of the things that's always fascinated me, and maybe that's the next book I'll write after 15 years, that's how long it takes me to do a book, is the whole question of love at the time of partition.
Oh.
Because what happened to people who were in love with each other and whose lives this historical event actually...
Love has an amazing quality, and love survives in any situation and can be born in any situation. I think there's a session in the afternoon, which unfortunately I won't be around for, but it's called Love in the Time of War and Revolution, something like that. So love happens, and there are some stories which show how, love survives in the most trying circumstances, and actually sometimes genuine love did happen between the abductor and the abductee.
Okay, I have one more question to ask you, and then we'll open it up for questions if you have any. And that is, well, 2 little questions actually. How did your mother sort of deal with the partition? She herself must have seen it. And can you tell us a little more about your father's work other than work on partition?
Well, my mother was, of course, also a slightly safer situation because her family had already moved here with my maternal grandparents because he was in the military farm service and they had been transferred here. So she saw a lot of partition as a disruption of what happened to her education, etc., and how to survive, and immediately that she had to, since she was married to this entire family which came as refugees, so what she would have normally had a very normal sort of marriage and family became this huge rebuilding exercise for several years. And she herself is a writer, so a lot of that she used in her own poetry and her own stories. So that, I mean, she's done a book of short stories which is called in Punjabi, the title is called Lahore Kinni Dur, how far is Lahore? And so she survived with that. Other work of my father, yes, he was primarily a short story writer, and that's how I suppose his academics and students best remember him as. But he did go through 15 years after partition, all that he had suffered finally impacted him, and somewhere in 63 or 64, he actually experienced a major nervous breakdown. And it could not be diagnosed until finally, because psychology was, or psychotherapy those days was not such a developed science as it is today. 50 years ago, nobody took these things seriously. Finally, one doctor had a long chats with him and he said, "Where were you during the partition?" And then when it started coming out, he said, "Okay, now we've got it. We know what's wrong with you." And this slowly he became. And there's a story in this book called Of One Community, when a Sikh man like this meets a Muslim man who's suffering from the same thing. And then they figure out that they were both caught in the riots in partition, and they both find their cure together. So they say, no, we are actually not different communities. We are the same communities, because there are only two kinds of communities in the world, one of the brutal and one of the meek. So we belong to the meek. And but after this, he wrote a lot of poetry. And he wrote a lot of epic poetry based on Sikh history. And that became his major work in the latter part of his life.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned this, his nervous breakdown and how he dealt with it. Because I think it is true that the trauma of partition, among all the people who lived through it, has been one of the most silenced things. We were talking about silence earlier. And recently, about I think 10 years back or something, a group of psychologists from Punjab have begun to now talk about this, look into hospital records, try and open up how people have coped with the trauma without counseling, without advice, and also without actually being able to talk about it. Because there's a kind of self-imposed silence that you don't want to talk about this at all. And I just want to tell you a story of one of the interviews that I was doing when I was doing my work on partition. And it was an interview with a man called Singh in Amritsar, who was one of three brothers who had gotten together and killed, they'd taken the decision to kill all the women and children in their family in order to protect them from potential abduction, rape, etc. And I asked him, he's a very nice man, and we were talking about this, and I said to him, how did you forget this? How did you live with this grief on your heart, and how, to get rid of your own family like this? And he said something which I've never forgotten. And he said it in Punjabi. So he turned around and he said, this golden land of Punjab, it's called the golden bird, Sone ki Chidiya, which is a phrase that is used quite a lot to describe Punjab. He said, you look at how green these fields are. We all came from there with nothing, with bare hearts, with bare lands, and we put all our forgetting and all our grief into this land. And it has given us back 100-fold what we put into it. I just thought that was really moving, and that kind of described this land of the Green Revolution in a somewhat different way, that all these refugees who came across gave to it everything they had in order to be able to forget. So anyway,
thank you.
Questions from...
I just wanted to know that short stories about partition, they are being translated. The effect of partition, is it kind of mitigated in them or is decreased in them? Because the original language must be Hindi or Punjabi, but we read them in English, and is it that we do not get to the real effect of them which we should reach?
Well, I suppose that depends on the translation. You heard one story. I'll leave it to you to judge.
Navtej, a very personal question. Of course, silence is important because, you know, the old saying, let the dead bury the dead. You know? But obviously to cope up with it. But religion is something we don't talk about these days because of the political connotation. Take away the political connotation, go internal. It can be very different. So was your father, that gives the people a lot of strength to actually cope with losses, you know? Give them compassion also. Where you see that the killer is actually not the killer, the individual that is, you know? So did your father, was he an intensely religious person or was he very agnostic? What kind of, just to understand how did he cope up with this? You know?
No, I think he was a very, if I can describe it, a very quietly and privately religious person. So that did give him a lot of strength. Yeah, take 2, 3.
My question is to both of you, or perhaps myself and everybody sitting here. You both talked about, the meek using silence as a way of coping with their pain and keeping the shame with them which was not theirs. Do you think if it had been better recorded, if people had spoken at that time and passed on that shame to the brutes, as you say, because it was their shame and held them accountable, held them responsible and put them to shame, that we could have avoided something like 1984 or 2002 incidences, etc.?
Maybe you take a couple of questions. Yeah.
You take 3, so you and then that gentleman, then
so, many of the impacts that you've described, both of individual and collective amnesia and trauma from these events, remind me of a lot of other atrocity crimes in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Cambodia, etc. Of course, there are a whole range of measures that have been adopted to address the consequences of this through memorialization, through projects to actually address personal trauma, to war crimes tribunals, for example. My question is, have there been any demands in India for similar measures to, even if only to record officially, or to deal with some of these consequences?
One more.
Basically, Navtej, I am a member of the divided family. Still, my family members are in Pakistan, and I traveled to India 5 years ago and staying over here in Jaipur. I personally want to share with you that how much that hurdles and how much that problems I feel over here, the stigmatization that I am a Pakistani that I feel over here, I cannot really share with you. One thing. Second thing is that the partition that took place 50 years ago or 60 years ago, and still it haunts and still it shapes our life. Okay? In my family members, I have met my cousin 25 years after. Okay? I don't know what is my cousin, who is my cousin, even my first real cousin, and still it goes on in my life. And that you are going to say about the 50 years ago partitions, these kind of ordeals, and it still is going on in my personal life. Okay? Later on that, my family members have met with the other family members from this side of body more than 50 years after. And one sister right now have met with his brother after 35 years. And it's a really a great historical, I think, it shouldn't be only took it a masquerade of people, but it still shapes the life of our youths also. So how do you think that, how much more it will goes on to do like so as it is going on right now?
Okay, can you hand the mic to the lady at the back, and Navtej, if you take the question. In the pink scarf, right at the back.
So I'll answer these before I forget. I think the first question, that why did the shame not be thrown back? I don't think the people who were suffering at that stage were in any position. They were too suppressed and they were too oppressed by grief and sorrow to do anything about it. And, it takes very, very long time for the meek to be able to stand off with the brutes. Ultimately, they do on the same level, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of courage and a lot of help. I come to the second question later, but on the last question, I think it's a tragedy, what you have described. And I think you symbolize in many ways what some of the families are still suffering. So we have to deal with this. And how we're going to deal with this depends upon today how the two countries deal with each other. But on a personal level, I think also you have to deal with it. And there somehow, somewhere now, as the generations go, there is greater confidence in the younger generations to be able to talk about these things and to take the necessary steps. I'm afraid we haven't done enough about the partition in terms of memorializing, in terms of recording, in terms of depiction. It has again been, sometimes people say, forget it now, it's 60 years, move on, why do you want, but this is historical memory. It is part of your attainment of independence. You cannot divorce this. So we really need to, much more has been done in many other situations, some of which you mentioned, and that helps the healing. But I'm afraid we have done so. How many films can we remember in India which are really made on the partition? Maybe 2 or 3. This is the biggest thing that has happened in this subcontinent in the last 150 years. And how many books have been written in English, major novels on partition? So, yes, please.
Could I just, can I add to come to your question a little bit? I don't think that there is any easy equation between speech and silence. I mean, it's not that if you break the silence and come into speech, it's going to immediately solve the problem. I don't think there's anything like that. I don't even think silence was a conscious coping strategy for many people, but it was the only option they had. And I think speaking out sometimes can be much more dangerous in many ways, because unless you're speaking into an environment which is hospitable and which wishes to receive what you're saying, you will be the consequences will be something that you will have to live with. But I think that we have been very reluctant in our society, in both India and Pakistan and also Bangladesh, to confront this history of ours. And had we been open about it, and had we been willing to talk about its human aspects, I think we may have been more tolerant, more willing to accept more. I mean, in a sense, if every television program that deals with the partition deals with the grand politics. Nobody bothers to talk about what happened to people. But why don't we talk about that? And if we would, it would possibly get us somewhere towards understanding how to deal with it. And then how to memorialize it. Because that's also, we're so scared of memorializing it because there are no easy good guys and bad guys in this. Both sides were completely complicit in the violence. So it's not that you can't say, the Jews and the Nazis and then it becomes something that you can it's stupid to say easily memorialize, but you can memorialize. I think this is a much more complex history, therefore more difficult.
True.
Sorry, I'll shut up.
That's good, yeah.
Question is actually about what you said about recording historical memory.
I can't hear you.
It is? Okay. My question is about what you said about documenting and recording historical memory for future generations. So in the Indian context with the partition and maybe globally with other atrocities, isn't it also a transfer of hatred to the newer generations? Documenting atrocities and tragedies that have happened to our forefathers?
I don't think so, actually. I don't think so. I mean, if this is, depends I mean, if you're talking of humanity, then where is the hatred? You're going to say that you're going to transfer memories, because if you transfer the whole set of memories, you'll find the good and bad, and you'll find the good and bad in every religion. And you'll find the good and bad on both sides of the line. So, and I think when you're transferring these 3 or 4 generations down, you know, the hatred aspect fades out, but the understanding remains. And that, I think, we owe it to the next generation to talk about it and say exactly this is what happened. I mean, how can an intelligent generation grow up not knowing what happened to their people only 70 or 80 years ago? I think that would be collective amnesia, which I'd hate to wish on my children or grandchildren.
जो पार्टीशन का नैरेटिव है उसके बारे में एक चीज़ मुझे प्रॉब्लमेटिक लगती है कि जो दूसरों ने किया, अदर्स ने किया, उसके ऊपर हम उसको नरेट करते हैं, लेकिन पार्टीशन के बाद एग्नी का जो दूसरा हिस्सा शुरू होता है वो यहाँ पे आके रीसेटलमेंट का है। उसमें जो जहाँ तक मैंने स्टडी किया है कि यहाँ पे आके रिफ्यूजीज़ को जो सेकंड ग्रेड सिटीजन के रूप में उसे माना गया और उसको यहाँ पे अपनी जड़ें लगाने में जो मुश्किलें हुई और जो इनकोऑपरेटिव किस्म का यहाँ पे लोगों का जो उनके प्रति व्यवहार था उसके बारे में बहुत कम लिखा गया है। जो यहाँ का एक्सपीरियंस, क्योंकि आपने भी देखा और आपके जो सरना साहब ने देखा, उसके बारे में जो राइटिंग है वो भी मिसिंग है, वो भी अपने किस्म की एक साइलेंस है जो अभी तक स्पीच में नहीं उतरी। इसके बारे में आप क्या कहेंगे?
इसमें ये बिल्कुल ठीक है, क्योंकि ये जो पार्टीशन में जो हुआ वो इट वाज नॉट वन मोमेंट कि दिस इज हैपेंड ऑन August 15, 1947 एंड दैट्स इट। नो, देयर वाज अ बिफोर एंड देयर वाज एन आफ्टर। उसमें जो पहले क्या हुआ, कौन लोग थे, क्या करते थे, कैसे रहते थे, वो यहाँ आके क्या हुआ, दिस इज फुल ऑफ स्टोरीज। But you're absolutely right. Academic work may have been done. I'm not so sure. Literary work has not been done enough on that.
But I think also, I'm answering your question in English. आप अंग्रेजी समझते हैं? I think also it is that it takes time, and it takes a certain moment when certain kinds of histories can become acceptable. And now that partition histories have started to open up, at least the hidden histories of partition, now you're beginning to see a whole range of work, looking not only at the Hindu, Muslim, Sikh part of partition, looking at minorities, looking at children, looking at music, looking at food, how all of that changed, looking at resettlement, looking at internal displacement, looking at partition in the Northeast, looking at the Sindhi experience of partition, because such a major event has to have so many layers and dimensions. And they are now beginning to open up. So maybe we'll learn more about it.
Let's take one question from Harsh.
Harsh, you have a question? We don't have time, but short question. I was asked by him to take a question.
I wasn't originally planning to say, but I was really moved by your father's, the way he's remembered partition. I belong to a family similar to yours from Rawalpindi. And most of the extended family remembers only what they did to us. And they refuse to remember any other part of the story. And therefore, when I took a position on 2002, for years I have heard from them that you were on the wrong side. And I said, I find it extraordinary. I'm exactly on the same side. I mean, of people who suffered violence and their lives broke down. And I think it's so rare to have somebody who recognizes that kinship of suffering and not of identity. And likewise, you're talking about memorializing. Every year in 28th February, we try to think of how to memorialize it in Gujarat. And we've come, my colleagues and I have decided that what we do every year is to find people who saved lives. And they come, the people whose lives were saved and the people who saved lives come together and tell their stories. So they recall the horror of what happened in 2002, but they recall it in a way that heals.
Thank you.